and I'm going to unfortunately say something extra, and that's really not nice. If you are over empathetic, it looks very nice to the outside. And maybe you've tried to tell yourself, yes, I'm a very kind person and I care a lot about people. But the thing is, if it does not come with healthy boundaries for yourself, then it's again a self-sacrificing element.
Okay, so I've seen your clips on social media, which are doing so well, and you like dive into not only mental health, but trauma. And I think trauma, when some people hear the word, they're like, oh, I don't have trauma. What would trauma mean to you, and how is that affecting people's lives?
Until this day, actually, the word trauma, I'm like every time cringing a little bit. I'm like, because it doesn't catch all the people out there, right? It's like immediately, like you said, people immediately like, no, I don't have trauma.
Yes.
But the thing for trauma for me is emotional wounds. And that's sometimes, of course, there's also the physical trauma, that's sexual trauma, all of those things that are very much like we can pinpoint it down to an event, moments, maybe sometimes even multiple moments that happen. But there's also the other thing, and that's also what a lot of people out there carry. And then I will say something controversial. I would say most people out there carry it. This is the emotional wounds, the lack and the absence of things that can be like you have not experienced, like that love from your parents that you would have needed, for example, or you were left alone a lot of times, and that creates also trauma. I struggle myself with the word, but it's really basically just the emotional wounds that we carry and the takeaways from that then trickle into how we navigate life, how it also shows up in the way we cope, that eventually comes out in our personality, and that we call then, that's me, that's us, like I'm anxious, I'm always anxious, always been, not always, maybe that's something the way you coped and the way you tried to survive, and that became now part of who you think and feel who you are these days. But you can actually heal that, and that's something what my content and everything I do is all about.
I was going to say, anytime you like heal one of these emotional wounds or traumas or whatever anyone wants to label it as, you can literally see your reality start to shift, and the things you attract and the people you attract and your triggers, like everything starts to change once you release these parts of you. So like for me personally, I'm like so excited to get things out of my blind spot because I want to like keep becoming my best version. But some people might be scared to look at them or want to blame the world and the outside circumstances for the way they are and don't want to face them. What are the most like common traumas or emotional wounds that people have? So maybe someone can resonate with one.
The most common emotional wounds?
Yes.
That's often the absence of things, right? So let's say, love that we didn't receive from our parents. And that leaves us later on navigating life, and maybe we would label it as like, oh, you're avoidant, or you're like very anxious and you try to win someone's love. But that's trauma. This is the emotional wounds that's very common. So either, and let's give it a label. I'm not a huge fan of labeling, but it makes it easier. You become a people pleaser. That's actually fawning, and fawning comes from that emotional wound of like, I give it a more practical example. I grew up with a, let's say, emotionally immature parent, someone who was constantly shouting, raging, unpredictable, or can be also narcissistic. As a child, your takeaway is not, mom and dad, they have a problem. No, your takeaway is like, ooh, how can I stay safe in this environment? That's how we're wired. That's how our nervous system and brain works. It wants us to feel safe and stay alive, basically. But the way of navigating that as a child, also because our brain is very different and we're still very much sponges, we go into like creating belief systems about ourselves. And that's where the subconscious becomes a very powerful thing. We believe, something's wrong with me. I need to change. Or how can I create safety in the home that's full of chaos and stress? By basically not making any noise, by shrinking myself, or by making sure that person, let's give it an example, dad being totally unpredictable, very like emotionally dysregulated, I'll make sure that person is always happy with me. So that I can stay safe. And that shows up later because we're doing this not just once. We're starting this somewhere, but we do it over and over and over. It becomes basically next to nature, our personality. And we do this over and over, not just in the relationship dynamic with our parents or siblings. We do this outside of our home. We do this in school. It kind of works also. And we become over empathetic, overly attuned into other people's emotions, but never had the moment of checking in with ourselves. Hey, how am I feeling? What are my needs and boundaries? And that's the people pleaser fun response. The other one is the avoidant, the one that is like, emotions, I never want to feel that again. Some people even have that moment of, this was so painful, so overwhelming, and their mind literally tells them, I never want to experience this again. And you make a disconnect from your body, basically nervous system, and your mind, and you start living in your mind. And that's where overthinking kicks in. Makes you also very successful, of course. Always two sides of the coin, right? But you're living in your head, you're constantly in stress. You're literally, whenever an emotion comes up, you're going back into your head, you're trying to rationalize it, push it away. There is no moment for your feelings. They're also wrong, particularly when you've been shamed, belittled, or you've been like told, oh, you're too much. So you become avoidant of the emotions. So that's how I would say these are the most common ways how trauma, these emotional wounds show up.
That's really cool to hear. I was going to say too, what I've realized also is some of them are like, so the root of it is so sneaky that it almost can like hide from yourself. Like for an example, people with trust issues, they might be like, okay, well, it had to have came from someone cheating on me or something happening. So then now that's why I don't trust anyone. But it also could be like, right, like things that you might not have related it to once you start doing the healing work. And you're like, oh, whoa, it was that made me have trust issues. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, trust is a thing, because there are two things with trust, right? It's the trust within yourself and the trust in others. The one with others, we can quickly say, yeah, I've been cheated on, there's betrayal trauma or other things, and we can say, I struggle trusting others. But often, there's also distrust within yourself. And that's what I think is very, very common as well. And that's also something to look out for if you feel like, oh, do I have emotional wounds? How do I feel within myself? What's the relationship within myself? Do I trust my own judgment? Because it's also how trauma changes your brain and your nervous system. But where you make the decisions, that's also impaired, that part of the brain. So you struggle, your self-doubt, that's a normal, common pattern as well.
I meet a lot of women that have trust issues with men. What would you say that this could stem back to if they can't specifically see it?
It starts often, of course, in the first relationships, right? So how was your relationship with your parents overall? It's not only the relationship with dad. It's the relationship with your parents and how they allowed you to explore already. So often that feeling of like, it starts with the self-trust, but also am I able to, it's not hyper-independence, but am I able to trust myself, my own judgment? But if I don't trust myself, how can I trust someone else? And unfortunately, and that's the other thing, the dating world these days is not really designed unless, we find that one very secure partner and it's all, happily ever after. But with all the apps out there and the way we kind of go quick to the next, we don't work through things as much, not anymore, but we also attract each other in different ways. That already proves to the mind, see, again, I attracted, that kind of guy. So what happened, or woman, what happens is we actually encourage, kind of fuel also our own internal wounds. And that's where the mind and the way we think sometimes is not always helpful. Because it's not always you or your real internal self or your subconscious trying to tell you something. It's your mind, of course, trying to protect you in that moment, but sometimes creates a different narrative. And that's what trauma is. It creates also a different filter of how you perceive the world, how you perceive others. And suddenly everyone, and that goes hand in hand with negative thinking. Not that negative thinking is per se always bad, but it's very much for people with trauma is very negative. Or that distrust is you always have that proof. Here we go again, see? And I cannot trust that person. I cannot trust that person. But it's that filter, this set of glasses that trauma has also created for you. That's why healing is so important. Not so that you blindly trust others and become really naive or, just fall back into the same sort of rabbit hole. No, it's about you can trust yourself, your own judgment, but that set of glasses that filter the way you perceive the world, the way you show up for yourself with boundaries, a form of self-love. That's also a form of protection in it, but it's not an armoring up. Your heart is still open, but protective for the right kind of people, for example. Then you attract, and that's the affirmation of the deep down thing. It's a form of manifesting in a way. Trauma manifests. I'm always attracting someone who is basically, let's say, abusive, or I'm not worthy. So you come from a lack of things, trying to prove yourself. Healing is, I'm a great person. That doesn't mean you're narcissistic. You're like, I'm worthy of someone who shows up for me equally. So it's a different way, and that's how the dynamics outside of you change. You meet someone suddenly who is emotionally available and there and actually sees you, fulfills your needs, not entirely, but matches them because you notice what they are.
100%. I was going to say that too. Like, it's so interesting because I made a video on this. I'm like, trust issues are only hurting yourself, because you're going to keep attracting situations to gain evidence on why you can't trust others. And you're going to be looking for it. You're on hypervigilance. Oh, they do this or this. You're constantly trying to seek evidence to protect yourself from the same feeling that you got when you were younger, right?
Yeah.
Something happened when you were younger because you didn't release this pain. You're constantly seeing the world in this way. And then little things can trigger that response of being like, oh, see, I can't trust them. But you're just like viewing, like you said, just viewing the world from that lens.
Yes.
And so that's why it's so powerful to like go into these things and not be afraid of them and try to heal them. And how would you go about like giving someone advice that's never really released any of these traumas, or they don't know which ones they have? What would you say like the first step is to try to discover like, okay, maybe this isn't reality. Maybe this is just like me reflecting.
The first step, and I know this is controversial, but the first step is always first getting a bit of an overview. That's self-awareness. Because and that's where information is really helpful. So content like yours, listening to podcasts, understanding, am I struggling maybe with like trauma? Is there this hidden invisible wound that I'm dealing with that plays out in my relationships and maybe my work life and my in general life, to get an overview and a bird perspective of like, oh, okay. Yeah, that can hurt, can be difficult, but when you know what you're dealing with, then you can dive into the next step, and that's the hardest one, to actually doing the work. Because it doesn't stop with talking about it, getting the awareness. It actually does like, okay, now I know everything, but now I'm going to deep dive into the doing the work. That means I create nervous system safety. I start also, and that's a challenging one, tackling a lot of times that harsh inner critical voice that feels so like you. And I address myself and speak to myself in a different way. I literally change also my body language. I expose myself, that's the window of tolerance, into past traumatic moments. I work through it. Can be trauma therapy. I know this again, a tricky word, but it's somatic work. All of those things to start rewiring, and that's the thing, your brain through neuroplasticity, but also your nervous system. And slowly and gradually, you will show up a little bit different. Not just it's not about the others, it's about for yourself, creating the boundaries, noticing, oh, yeah, that's actually my need, that's my real need. It's not just something that I think about. I feel different. And that's really the work. Self-awareness, doing the work. You will notice things changing within you and then outside of yourself as well.
Yeah, it's so powerful. Walk people through somatic work. Is that one you've seen help a lot?
Oh, yeah. I can honestly say that's something I integrate also in my work. It needs to be a good combination of information, talking through it. You need also find a little bit the red line of like what's the kind of traumas that I'm dealing with. So that sometimes requires, and there's nothing wrong with it, help and support through a group work, through a therapist, through a coach, however, to help you identify where are these wounds and how to process them, because When you think with yourself, you always want to end up in the same loop. You need someone who helps you challenge the way you think, the way you feel. And somatic work is really powerful, because somatic work helps you with your nervous system. And somatic work can be also EMDR to an extent, for example, which I'm a huge fan of. And there are different forms of somatic work. Or, I also integrated in my trauma healing program, where you really do small but intentional movements. So it's like integrating, and the body responds. We are one person, right? So it's like, I believe in that, in this scientifically backed mind-body connection. When I think a certain thought, I probably have felt already anxious. So dealing with ways of grounding myself, coming back into the present moment, feeling my body, not just living in my head, is very important, and an important part of the trauma healing work.
What was really wild for me is that traumas can also be, no, they pretty much are actually, right? Connected to physical things that happen in your body, even like illnesses, back pain. Like I realized mine one time in my EMDR healing. I talked to her, I was like going like this while I was in therapy, and she's like, "What's wrong with your jaw?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's just like TMJ acting up." She's like, "Let's go into it." And so we went into my jaw, and like really, I just paid attention to it. She's like, pull it out of yourself. Like if you were to pull that energy out of yourself, like what color, what is it? What is it trying to tell you? And then you kind of just allow the answer to come to you. For anyone that doesn't know, you kind of just go into a peaceful mind and just allow the answer to come up, and whatever comes up is the right thing. And I just felt like it kind of led me down to fear of letting go. Fear of not being in control. You
big
need to
thing.
like control things, fear. And so then I kept going through it, and at some point I felt my jaw like release, and I haven't had TMJ since, which is wild. I just did that, and it's like wild, because a lot of these things are connected to their stored pains in the body, right? And now I'm like so excited to get to the next one, because I've constantly had lower back pain, and it's mostly from my hip on my right side, and then my right knee now hurts, and then my right arm is like having some pinched nerve with it, and then I'm finding out that's like my masculine side.
Yes, exactly. Feminine and masculine, that's so true.
Yeah, so that's cool. Have you discovered that too with different stuff?
Yeah, it's really something. And for me, what I notice in my work is people come with a lot of unexplained things, and it's not depending on the severity of your trauma. Even, let's say, and there's nothing to judge. Like everyone has trauma, but the way your body and your mind responds to it is not very different to, let's say, severe sort of trauma. Trauma should not be judged in a certain way. But the other thing is, it always shows up somewhere in the body, and sometimes people have massive rashes showing up. I, for example, lost a tooth because of clenched so much always my jaw. Or autoimmune disorders is very much linked to also complex PTSD, which is trauma in like childhood, for example, or the lower back pain, the neck pain. People would say the neck pain comes because you carry all the emotional weight, for example, of something of the world sometimes even. Or stomach pains. I remember when I went through 10 years ago through my trauma healing, and in the beginning of it, I couldn't tolerate any food, but I never had an allergy. I had no intolerances, but I couldn't keep food in. But it was not because I had an eating disorder. I loved food, but anything I touched was just coming out. And it's just the body starting to, and that's the thing we don't see. And that's why I think it's such an important topic to talk about. So many people struggle with it. And just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. We are just dealing with it within ourselves, and often shame or guilt, or the feeling of people are going to judge me, or I'm too much. We hide things, we suppress it, and that's how eventually it shows up in our body.
Exactly. It's like I heard something a while ago, and I think it was Oprah on her sorry, I'm just going to turn the air down. I think it was Oprah on her network. It was a clip I saw of her. She's like, the universe is going to constantly give you signs. Initially, it's going to be like a tap on the shoulder. It's going to be light. And then they're going to be like, okay, now that you're going to feel this negative feeling, now it's like stronger. Then it's going to be like a brick over the head. And if you keep ignoring it, keeps going into bigger degrees. So like, it'd be like that pain you feel in your chest, but you suppress it, and then you keep suppressing, and then your reality starts to reflect that pain, and then you're ignoring it and acting like you don't see it, and then you're just blaming it on the world. And then next it's physical ailments, and then it gets to some crazy physical ailment in the future, and it was all from some maybe stored emotion that you could have just looked at.
That's true, but that's actually a very much true statement, because trauma keeps on showing up in your life until you address it. So yes, a lot of times you had maybe trauma, let's say very young age, let's say 6 years old. Of course you couldn't navigate it back then. You didn't know it was trauma. It was maybe even your normal. Like, let's say it's very much easy for a child to say, well, mom and dad were not present. That was just my normal. Only later, when you're like 16 maybe in your early 20s, you start comparing. You're like, okay, Lisa's parents were always there. Yes. They show up for her graduation and they cheer for her or they hug her. My parents don't hug me. So you start having reference points. But once you notice that, first of all, that's the indicator of like, I should start my healing journey. But the other thing is the trauma keeps repeating itself if you don't address it. So it doesn't just show up once. It actually can lead you, and that's the problem, eventually, for example, into burnout, into extreme cases, rock bottom moments where you don't want to, let's say, live anymore. Or abuse shows up not just once. Most of the time it shows up multiple times, or people, because of the trauma and the way it impacts your brain, you lose the focus and suddenly you have an accident. The obvious trauma, a lot of people I notice have that. They're like, oh, but that was my first trauma. And if we dive deeper, we actually notice trauma actually happened way earlier. It's just you coped quite well, you were hyper functioning in it, but actually it started way earlier.
What do you think about anxiety and how that maybe shows up in people's life? Is that considered a trauma from something that they might not have released?
Often, yes. Often, yes. I mean, a lot of people come, for example, to me and say, like, I have anxiety and I want to treat it. First of all, I think the very important message is anxiety we should not get rid of, but it's a bit of like, let's balance it out. We need anxiety in order, if there's a real emergency or real threat, that we actually feel anxiety. But if you live with heightened, constant, chronic anxiety, that's a sign. Or if you have these waves, they come unexplained. They often go also hand in hand with phases of depression or these, heavy moments. But it is something to look out for, because it's not, quote unquote, whatever is normal, but to live with more phases of anxiety if there's not a real danger or threat. So that's something to look into. Most of the time there is something.
Yeah, because like I've had friends around me that have really bad anxiety. I had suffered with anxiety for a while. I've gotten a lot better, but also the feeling of like not feeling safe in their body, like constantly like worried about the worst case scenario going to happen, and then they can't stop, and then they're not feeling safe in their body, and they're
that's hypervigilance. So if you live in a state of hypervigilance, that already, let's say, throws you outside of your body, and you're trying to find safety maybe even outside of yourself. So sometimes we're overthinking a lot. That's trying to think of worst case scenarios, or you think back and think, oh, how could I have done this different? But you're not in the present moment. You're also not in your body. So you're somewhere else with your mind trying to solve it, maybe. Or you're asking someone else outside of you to give you a form of reassurance. So you're giving and handing away already, and that's the other thing. Trauma goes often with that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, which triggers anxiety. But if I need someone else to make me feel okay again, even if it's through words, am I going to be okay? And you say, yes, you're going to be okay. I handed you the power over how I can feel. With your answer of the yes, in the moment I feel, all right, okay. But that's the thing. That's not a long-term thing. Deep down, my nervous system and mind will need that again, because I don't trust myself enough. And that's the thing. That's the emotional wounds. That's the trauma playing out constantly and all the time. I'm helpless, I'm powerless, I cannot do this, I cannot rely on myself, I'm not strong enough in this world, the world is too scary, too big, and so on and so forth. That is something we can change within ourselves.
If you had to like feel where that would stem from, what would you say that could come from as in your childhood to feel not safe in your body or trust yourself?
That can be really, for example, most simplest example is growing up with a narcissistic parent.
Yes.
If you grow up with a parent that is unpredictable, and I'm struggling, I know we label the narcissists too much, and yes, they have had also that trauma, but if you grow up in an unsafe home, and unsafe does not necessarily mean physically. You can have food, you can have education, you can live a luxurious life. But if there's an emotional element where you feel like unsafe, again, that can be through mom and dad fighting. And yes, that's normal for a lot of people. But children's takeaway is like, ooh, this is not safe. And if you're somehow also involved in it, that can mean you carry the emotional weight, even for a sibling sometimes. That's too much to carry. But what happens to you is you start feeling unsafe within yourself. And that's something that comes from your nervous system, but also because, not for everyone, but for some, depending on the severity, but your brain changes. The alarm, the smoke alarm, that's the amygdala of your brain, is basically constantly activated. And that's the major trigger for constant anxiety, constantly hypervigilant, constantly being basically in survival mode. Because the part of the brain where you maybe would have perspective shifts or where you would rationalize things, that's the prefrontal cortex. That's not online. In survival, you're basically literally just trying to survive. So anxiety is needed, stress is needed, that constant energy, and that's what people underestimate. The amount of energy that it takes from your body to live in that constant survival mode. You are, of course, extremely exhausted all the time. And rest is not going to be rest because your brain cannot really go into deep sleep and recharge. And the parasympathetic nervous system where you would recharge, rest, is basically not really possible to enter into. So you're constantly in fight, flight, or freeze, where you just eventually numb out.
Wow, I resonate with this so much. I have this because my mom was depressed when I was younger, so she didn't pay attention to me as much, and I didn't know why, I didn't understand it, but it was since I was like 2. So I think constantly not knowing how she's going to feel because she didn't really show much emotion. So that definitely maybe put me on hypervigilance because then now as I'm older, I've realized that I have that it came up to constantly seeing how people are feeling. So then I got strong with my empath. Like I became more of an empath because I constantly am like looking how everyone feels in the room. But then there's like a hypervigilance of like, I've dated someone previously that was like so confident with themselves and so assured of themselves. They didn't feel the need to be liked by everyone. And so there's situations where we go into a room and I could tell that someone took something the wrong way or like maybe didn't feel fully comfortable. And I'm like, they think you don't like them. Like, be nicer. Or like, you know, because I can like feel what everyone's feeling. Yeah. And so it made me so uncomfortable because I'm always watching how everyone is feeling. So then it comes up to like the overly taking on everyone else's feelings, and then now I feel responsible for how everyone's feeling, and then it gets so exhausting, and then
that's terrible. It's really terrible, and I'm gonna unfortunately say something extra, and that's really not nice, but I've been in the same shoes. If you are over empathetic, it looks very nice to the outside. And maybe you've tried to tell yourself, yes, I'm a very kind person and I care a lot about people. But the thing is, if it does not come with healthy boundaries for yourself, then it's again a self-sacrificing element. And you are, again, what you said, emotionally overgiving. You're emotionally mirroring and monitoring others. And you're living constantly outside of yourself and never have the time to check in with yourself. Or even express, hey, no, I don't like that. Or you feel like, I cannot even say that, you know, I don't matter. So that's the pattern of being overly empathetic. It's like you never make it on the priority list. Another thing is you might fall for the wrong people because you always find the good.
Oh,
in
I
people.
definitely always find the good. It's
It's beautiful, but on the other hand, also very tricky because you might end up in patterns of dating or relationships that are actually not healthy for you.
I constantly focus on the good. It's not good.
It's over justifying.
Yes.
That's over justifying and always trying to find almost a reason to stay. And it brings an element of, I can fix this because I see it. I know what he or she need to do if they only did that and that and that. And then you live in the potential of a person or a relationship and not in what really is serving you.
For sure. That's huge. I definitely have been there many times. I was going to say too, what I've realized also when I was just like sitting with myself in my meditation, I was like, what would you want me to know, like to my higher self? And I just got it just like a download is what I would call it. It like just dropped down. I was like, my root chakra is blocked. And then when I looked into that more, I'm like, well, what would it mean if my root chakra is blocked? It's like fear of abandonment and all these things. And then also abandoning probably myself for others.
Yeah.
Because, right?
We do that.
Yeah, we do that.
That's the easiest thing to do for, it's not, maybe not the right word thing to say, over empathetic, but if you're an over empathist, is it empathist? No, what's the word? Over, if you're overly empathetic. Yeah,
empathetic.
Exactly. If you're empathetic, overly empathetic, then you quickly go into, and that's the language of the mind, and that's actually also very anxiety driven and often fear based. It justifies for you your actions while you're doing things the way that are actually not really good for you. It's like, oh, yeah, it's okay. You're doing something nice for others, and you're never doing something nice for yourself. You always have this is the carrot and the stick, but the carrot never shows up. It's like the next thing. And if you do this, then you get that. That's like very much constantly having to also work for things, prove things, chase things, and the fear of abandonment keeps you also sometimes too long. So to say in relationships, as an example, but it can be any relationship.
For sure. This is exactly what I'm personally healing right now. I'm going through this exact one. So like trying to find, and I'm trying to find, question myself of like, okay, when am I just making excuses or when am I living in the potential because I can see exactly what someone would need to heal.
Yeah.
And I would want them to do to heal it. And I'm like, oh, it's just so clear. And then I'm making excuses. So yeah, that's huge.
Reparenting is a huge element of healing as well. And it's always sounds a bit like, how do I do that? It goes with the awareness. It goes with the nervous system healing, but also making sometimes tough choices based on what you know, based on the work you're doing of like, wait a minute. Is this really, if I look at it from a birth perspective, for example, the relationship that fulfills me and I should be in? Because a lot of times we know it's just that element of self-protection. That's what a parent should have done, let's say, that we then have to show up for ourselves. And you only need to do that one time to start changing the language also and the way you respond to yourself. Show one time up as your inner parent and do a decision that feels in the moment like, oh no, I lose that person, or no, I know I'm gonna be alone. But if you do that and sit with it and work with it, you start changing everything.
That's so powerful. That's cool. So you could just do it like one time and you're slowly starting to align with that part of you.
Yes, because it starts with trust building within. Can I trust myself? It's showing up and that one-time promise and showing up and actually doing it. It's like, oh yeah, it did hurt maybe. And sometimes healthy parenting also sometimes hurts, not physically, but it's like, I'm doing this because I love you. This is a no, but out of love. And that's the same thing as like, we're not going to stay in this relationship if it's really this, let's say, toxic or unhealthy for you. If your needs are not met and you sit constantly with resentment and then the hope that something would change or the future potential, this is not good for you. So no, because I love myself. And that's where healing actually also really takes place and happens because you're doing something that you normally would not do.
What about people that might blame themselves a lot for a situation? Might just make excuses. There's some people are constantly taking on like, oh, it's me, and not being confident enough to just be like, no, these are my boundaries, or like, just being confident in themselves, self-trusting. I guess it all comes back to not trusting themselves.
Yes, it does. And it not trusting is very much the layer underneath is often fear. Because if I don't trust myself, I'm very fearful. Fearful of, let's say, losing things, losing myself, not being able, I don't know, to survive it to some extent. But that's trauma, right? That's trauma playing out. So the way of doing that, and it's not a one-way street now, let's say, affirm and do the affirmation work. It's a different parts work. It's like, I'm going to do the reparenting, I'm going to do the inner child work, but I need to do, that's the important part, first need to find the safety within my nervous system. I need to step out of survival mode that sometimes we live in for decades or even our entire life, that constantly living in that kind of anxiety and stress. And if I then, because then everything comes back, your creativity suddenly comes back. Suddenly you can actually experience also joy. But the next thing is, you start feeling, oh, this is what I really would need. This is, and when you create more moments when you feel like, okay, that's nice. Or I feel like, oh, this is different. You're teaching yourself, not just in your mind, but also in your body, how life can feel also very different from what you used to know. And that's the thing, stepping out of familiar territory that often is chaos, stress, trauma, anxiety, you name it, into, okay, this is calm, this is nicer, I feel more grounded, I feel more warm here, I feel I can breathe differently. It's literally like that. So it's the work is very holistic.
And what about how, when you heal, I would love you to walk through this, how you can heal one wound and it's kind of like a tree with like branches and it kind of heals other things, right?
Yeah, that's actually true. You name it a tree. I always say it's like a little bit of a red line of things that can go. So the thing is, you mentioned EMDR, for example. It's not that, and we sometimes have hundreds of traumas, right? Trauma does not show up through that one event only, not for everyone at least. It's like these small wounds, these small stabs. There's moments over and over that created these wounds. So you just need to find, with EMDR as an example, and that's where the help is needed from someone else, but you can do this also in a group work or with help and support, find a little bit that red line of what's my wound actually. What is it? Is it the fear, let's say, of being lonely and abandoned? Because that's a wound. And you just need to find one or two examples. But the beauty of it processes, if you process in EMDR that wound, sometimes it processes simultaneously other similar related wounds as well. It's like, I always say, like it's a bit like a bookshelf. All the books fall out. They organize and reorganize themselves over a certain time period, but you're not looking at every book. You're just organizing them, and maybe you look at a few books, but it subconsciously programs and reprograms also a little bit your belief system about yourself. And the more stronger, the more grounded, and the more self-loving and kind you become, and more self-aware and more looking inward, the more secure, I think that's the word, you become. That the language, the way you also eventually change, maybe you notice it in yourself, the more you do the healing work, the language, the way you speak, not just within yourself, it starts there, but also then with others. It changes, it forms different ways of communication. Suddenly you can dive deeper, you enjoy different conversations with people, you can create emotional depth, emotional intimacy away from the physical one. So that's how things overall, and that's the beauty of healing, it changes within, and that's maybe where it starts, but it goes and travels outside of you, and suddenly you're like almost living an entirely different life, but not that one that you don't like, but something that maybe you always wanted.
I was gonna say too, which is fascinating, that something that I've been thinking is like certain, like you hear this, like certain relationships are just meant to teach you a lesson, right?
Yeah.
So like you can attract someone in your life and it might be a short lesson, it might be a longer one, and some people stick in that lesson forever because that relationship was attracted to them for it to mirror some part of them that they're meant to heal, but they can always just maybe stay and never want to heal that, and then you're constantly like toxically bonded kind of, because you guys are both like kind of like feeding each other's
Yeah,
traumas,
yeah,
right?
it's often like
And
that,
there's
yeah.
a lot of people that stay in those relationships, or those are the ones in the future that maybe get divorced. And then that's why the more I was realizing all this stuff, I'm like, it's so important to go through these different experiences and reflects back on relationships on like, what was that relationship meant to teach me? Why did I attract this relationship? What things from this relationship were also patterns in previous relationships?
Very
Because then
good.
I'm the common denominator in this now,
Yeah.
if I've seen it more frequently. And then work on those pieces so that you can release it and no longer attract it in your future relationship. And then I was like, okay, so you keep going through life and you're learning these relationships. But then it's like, okay, the right person for you then, from my perspective, but I would love to know yours, is then the person that, yes, maybe they come mirror some part of you need to heal, and you mirror some part of them they need to heal. But the right person is going to be healing those with you, right? It's like a journey, because we never fully will stop wanting to release things, and at different parts of our lives we're ready to release others. And so the right person is just going to almost evolve with you, right?
True. That is actually, and I'm not saying that's the recipe for the perfect relationship, but if you ask me, my personal take, I fully agree with you. It's taking, first of all, you take ownership also of, oh, wait a minute, what's my pattern in here? Like, how am I showing up in these dating situations, or why am I always drawn to these people? But it's also okay looking into, oh, okay, that's what they did to me. It's a mix of not victimizing, but like, ooh, okay, that's what they did to me, wasn't okay. But I take also ownership, so lessons learned for the next ones. But the person and that's life. I think we always will be triggered somehow, somewhere. Trauma doesn't just stop. The emotional wounds might even continue. Even an emotional wound is, and that's trauma also, the unliving of a parent when they're old. That's also trauma. That's part of life. I think that's very much a misconception, but it's the way we deal with it, the way we allow it and process it, and that's the same in relationships. Yes, he or she might trigger me, but it's about, are they having a level of care that this affected me, and we can communicate and not necessarily heal that together, but change the way that we trigger each other and work on it. And if you tell me, even in a friendship, hey, that did hurt me because that triggered an anxiety in me, if I have a level of care, even as a random stranger, I'd be like, oh, sorry, I didn't know. For me, it's not anxiety triggering, but because I care on a human level. And I think that's the importance in any form of relationship. A level of care, what my actions, my behavior does to you. That doesn't mean I can match your entire needs, but I can be aware and caring enough. And that's important, and that's how you go hand in hand with also a life partner of like, okay, we figure each other out. We learn our language, also the language of trauma. And I'm trying to understand what yours are. Your childhood trauma might be different than mine. The way your parents had argued, also different. That's maybe how you argue with me, and I argue with you how I grew up. But if we understand and have compassion, empathy, but still hold our own boundaries of like, I need respect from you, and you need maybe a level of care or maybe a little bit more explanation from me, then we find a wonderful way of navigating, and we both feel seen and heard and okay in this relationship, can grow together and walk.
That's huge. That's huge. I was going to say the biggest thing is feeling seen, right, in a relationship.
Yeah.
If you don't feel seen and you're constantly exhausting yourself with trying to explain your needs to someone and they don't see you, it's just like, that's the most important thing, right? For someone to feel that someone can get there with you.
The worst feeling, and I'm not sure if you can relate, is if you're sitting in a relationship and let's say you love that person so much and you see the potential and you want to live life with them, but you sit yourself in a deep level of resentment because you always feel like they don't care, they don't listen, they're not matching or acknowledging my needs. And that can be emotional, that can be physical, but if you sit and feel alone with it, that you carry the entire relationship, even if it's only emotionally, that builds eventually resentment and eventually disconnect. And that's not growing together. That's eventually one person growing and the other one staying where they are. And that's where I would say eventually divorce, cheating, all of those things actually happen.
Mm-hmm. That's so powerful. I agree. Is there any certain things that you've really loved learning lately or you're discovering that you want to share?
I'm a huge fan of breath work.
Oh, amazing.
Breath work is one thing that I find tremendously powerful. But I would say first do really the self-awareness work, finding the safety within. And if you then still feel like, hey, I mean, healing is a journey, breath work is wonderful. But I'm a huge fan of all the things, all the elements of holistic work. That's also nutrition. I find that also very important if you deal with anxiety. Everything that fuels our body emotionally or physically in some ways is all combined. And I think that's something that I'm learning at the moment, how powerful it is to always bring everything back into yourself.
So how is nutrition tied to it? I would just be curious to know that.
It's, for example, if we have a, let's say, unhealthy diet, there's a lot of science backed. Like if you eat only processed food or sugar, you see sometimes content creator even testing this. If I eat in the evening sugar, your sleep is impacted. Same as with alcohol, your sleep is impacted. I think same is also with drugs to a certain, even if they're legalized in some countries, people don't know that this impairs also the way how your brain blocks basically you to go into deep sleep. But for trauma healing or in any forms of, let's say, if you deal with anxiety or depression, particularly sleep or trauma processing, sleep is so important. But if it's blocked, you never have a good night's rest. So it becomes a vicious cycle. So that's one thing. So nutrition plays a role. What you drink, what you eat is very important. So there's huge benefits around it as well. Sometimes the lack of certain nutritions actually does create, like for you, mood disorders. It feels like, it looks like depression. So it masks it or mirrors it. Or you have anxiety, but it's the lack of certain nutrition. So it's very much interesting way of, and that's part of what I like to do, the holistic work, bringing everything in. That doesn't mean you have to be all good and eat always healthy and so on, but it's about learning and educating yourself about it.
Yeah, because I definitely noticed that too. Like certain things you could just be missing from your diet, which then will trigger more anxiousness. Yeah. For an example, like I found out that when I stopped eating gluten, my anxiety went down significantly. I think because like the inflammation and things like that. Yeah. So I don't really have it as much anymore, which is weird. But yes,
fascinating.
Yeah. So some people might have like inflammation in their body, and then it's triggering. For me, it was inflammation, which was probably swelling my thyroid, which is pushing against maybe my nervous system in some way or something with that. And it was triggering anxiety. But I know that with my mom, she was very low iron. And so when she did her blood test, figured out what she's missing, that helped her to introduce the iron. So it's like, yeah, it's just educating yourself in those ways too. I think you're right.
Yeah, people underestimate the power of the gut. So the gut is, for a lot of people in the science world, the second brain. So what you eat, and that's the mind-body connection. Again, it's not just the nervous system, so it's also the gut in a way. And the gut is where you take all the nutrients and so on, and it sends it everywhere into your body. It plays a huge role.
So powerful. Okay, so tell everyone where they can find you. I know you have ways where people can actually talk to you one-on-one, right?
They can talk one-on-one, or they can join my trauma healing program. I have a 3-month trauma healing program that's called Phoenix. It really is comes from my heartfelt mission of really helping people transform themselves and heal from rock bottom to, let's say, live life. It's very intense. So that you can find on my website is carolinemidelsdorf.com. Otherwise, you find me on Instagram. That's also quite simple. Caroline Middelsdorf, not the easiest name. YouTube, I have also a podcast.
Amazing.
It's real, raw, and authentic. And TikTok. That's it.
Amazing. You're so awesome. And I love your videos. You're healing so many people. So I appreciate you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. It was great conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Please comment, let me know what parts you loved the most, and tell me what you want me to speak about next. I read them all, I respond to you all, and please subscribe. This means the most to me to come on here each week and connect with you all. I love you so much, and as you know, I come back every week, so I'll see you soon.